Magic systems and the spells within them are integral to the core gameplay mechanics of most mainline entries in the Final Fantasy franchise. They increase gameplay depth and allow for versatility in how players can engage with combat systems, and many spells are designed with quality of impact in mind, which is underscored by their visual spectacle. But not all spells are created equal. Since its inception in 1987, development teams have introduced over 30 years worth of spells to the Final Fantasy franchise. With each new entry, old spells are iterated upon to better fit the gameplay mechanics and context of that game, and in some instances, new spells are even brought into the fold. Although all spells are developed with the intention of having a reasonable degree of utility for the player, some end up falling short of expectations, and this could either simply be due to having lackluster impact or an oversight in development that led to a spell-breaking bug. We've covered a few of these spells before in a previous video, but for this video, we wanted to turn this over to you, the viewers. So with the caveat that we won't be including more than one spell per game, here are 7 spells that ended up being almost completely useless according to you, the viewers. And we're going to kick things off with Death from Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is a game that thematically focuses on the concepts of life and death, and this makes it all the more ironic that one of the most useless spells in the game is death itself. Across the entire Final Fantasy franchise, death and its variants of instant death spells have appeared in a consistent manner. But in spite of this, the utility of death spells is often quite limited. Most bosses or enemies with large HP pools are often designed to be immune to death, given that disposing of such a powerful enemy with just one action would undermine their intended role in the game. There are some exceptions to this across the franchise, of course, but generally speaking, death has inconsistent utility. Final Fantasy X then takes that lack of utility to the next level, to deliver perhaps one of the weakest manifestations of the spell across the entire franchise. Part of the reason for this was that players were not able to unlock death until they had made significant progress on their sphere grid. Based on how much of the story needed to be progressed, by the point in which death was acquired, notable enemies would be immune. Those enemies that weren't immune, such as the Araman, which could be encountered inside Sin, were also easy enough to dispatch with regular offensive magic spells, rendering death almost obsolete. Furthermore, using death to kill an enemy was not really advantageous in Final Fantasy X due to how the leveling system worked. Each party member only received AP if they performed an action during an encounter, so ending a battle too quickly with an instant death could deprive party members of valuable AP that was then used to progress the sphere grid. Furthermore, by using death, it was not possible to create an overkill scenario. This mechanic was put in place to reward players who trounced enemies, offering up to 2 times the regular AP and bonus items to celebrate the nature of their victory. It's therefore quite valuable for those looking to maximize the sphere grid in less time, but using death nullifies the mechanic. Asuna has become a staple white magic spell in the Final Fantasy franchise due to how much utility it often has. In almost all manifestations of Asuna throughout the franchise, it's able to remove the majority of the core status ailments from a party member all at once. This makes it a very valuable asset when being struck by, say, bad breath, or from other enemies who dish out countless status effects such as blind, silence, or toad. But that's where the Final Fantasy IX version of Asuna differed though, as it fell way short of the high expectations players had for this spell. Although it does still remove common status ailments like poison, silence, and darkness amongst others, there are many more status ailments in the game that Asuna does not remove, and some examples here are slow, stop, berserk, and virus. The other negative was that by the time Asuna was even made available to the party, it no longer had that much utility due to its limited status ailment coverage. And, to further underscore this, Asuna could only be used by Aiko and the temporary party member Beatrix, meaning that of the 2 permanent white mages the party had access to, only one of them had access to Asuna. Due to a mixture of limited utility, limited availability, and limited versatility, this meant that the Final Fantasy IX version of Asuna was nowhere near as useful as other iterations, and it's no doubt why a large portion of commenters recommended its inclusion on this list. Final Fantasy XI is a game that often gets overlooked due to its designation as an MMO. However, some elements of the game come up time and time again, and one of those elements is its novel use of sense mechanics in relation to enemy aggro. Enemies could aggro in Final Fantasy XI based on sight and sound, and although enemies wouldn't identify a target based on scent, they could use smell to track a target they were already pursuing, using that sense in conjunction with other means of tracking like sight. Deodorise was a spell designed to reduce a player's scent, which meant certain enemies who could track by scent would track for a shorter period of time if they lost a line of sight. This would mimic the effects of running through water or rain in the game, but this reduced the usefulness of the spell because its effects could be replicated through other means. But the effects of the spell also weren't that useful. If an enemy was already aggroed, all the player had to do was just generally keep running a bit further until they escaped. The other, less than helpful element was that casting Deodorise required a player to stand still, and with a casting time of 2 seconds, enemies were given the chance to catch the player up, generally negating the effect of Deodorise by the time it was cast. It was only therefore really effective if cast in advance, but its effect would only last for 10 minutes after being cast, and it couldn't be refreshed. If an enemy also happened to attack the player after Deodorise had been applied, the effects would also be cancelled. To make this spell useful, players therefore needed to somehow predict this and cast the spell in advance or reapply the spell approximately every 8 to 10 minutes in order to get the most of its effects. And this, in conjunction with its limited application, made it pretty useless, especially compared to Sneak or Invisible. Final Fantasy VIII is a game that took an experimental approach to gameplay mechanics and spells through the junction system. Unlike previous games, where spells were often exclusively used in combat scenarios, via the junction system in Final Fantasy VIII, they also had a direct and significant influence on character progression. This allowed some spells with less traditional value to be balanced out by having greater junction value, but unfortunately, that wasn't always the case, as evident by the Float spell. Float had a middling junction value, but it also wasn't very useful as a traditional spell either. As in previous games, when used in combat, Float would cause a target to float in the air, making them immune to earth-based attacks. But this benefit could also be achieved by characters simply junctioning Quake. It meant Float became a fringe spell that was only useful against specific bosses, so the majority of players could go through their entire playthrough without ever feeling the need to use Float in any capacity. The most notable application for Float came in the Tomb of the Unknown King, as it could be used in an offensive and unorthodox manner to counter the earth regeneration of the brothers Minotaur and Sacred. However, both of the brothers were also weak to poison, which achieved a comparable effect. The other notable use case for Float was that it could be used defensively against Cerberus to avoid the damage it would deliver when it combined triple with Quake. However, once the player overcame this fight, Float became mostly obsolete for the rest of the game. The original Final Fantasy can be considered quite innovative for its time, and it ended up being a very ambitious project. Unfortunately, that ambition came at a cost, as the initial North American release came with a handful of bugs, and one bug in particular was so bad that it didn't just make the affected spell useless, it ended up making the game even harder when it was used. Lock 2, which has since been renamed to Fakara, was a black magic spell that was intended to reduce the evasion of all enemies by 20, the objective being that this would enable melee attacks to be more likely to land. However, due to a programming error, Lock 2 had the opposite effect. Instead of decreasing evasion by 20 points, it increased enemy evasion by 20 points, and this in turn made enemies much harder to hit. This application was pretty brutal, as Lock 2 would often have been cast when the player was facing off against a group of tough enemies that were hard to hit. Thankfully, this oversight was rectified for future iterations of the game, allowing the spell to work as intended. Sight is an often forgotten magic spell in the Final Fantasy franchise. It has appeared in a handful of mainline and spin-off games, but due to changes in player expectation, its use started to dwindle. After being introduced in Final Fantasy III, Sight returned in Final Fantasy IV, and its primary purpose was to grant visibility of the world map. Its inclusion therefore created an extra gameplay burden, as to view the world map, players would need to cast a spell, and doing so would cost MP. Still, in general, that didn't inherently classify the spell as useless. If anything, it made it more frustrating. The main reason that the Final Fantasy IV version of Sight has often gained the useless classification, however, is due to the linearity of the game. This meant that it was almost never necessary to view the world map, which in turn made the spell quite useless. Perhaps due to realizing this themselves, modern re-releases of Final Fantasy IV have made the Sight spell redundant by just granting access to the world map without even requiring the spell to be cast. But this could have also just been influenced by the internet and strategy guides becoming more prevalent, because instead of casting the spell, someone could just look the information up with relative ease. That then brings us on to the final entry of this list, the Physics spell from Final Fantasy XIV. Because of the large number of classes available to players, Final Fantasy XIV provides players with many ways to restore HP, and in this regard, Physic acts as the standard healing spell for Arcanists. Players who are Arcanists may later go on to become either Scholars or Summoners, each of which has access to a version of the Physic spell. But the version that is available to Summoners is notable because of the way that its scaling mechanics work. Physic essentially loses all real use once the Summoner is above level 50, as it's at this point that the Summoner no longer receives a Mind bonus from their equipment. This then severely reduces the effectiveness of Physic, which scales off the Mind attribute. This problem becomes quite notable because the max HP of players around this level will be relatively large in comparison to how much Physic can heal for. This gap then only continues to grow as time passes, because both max HP and the amount of damage enemies deal will continue to outpace Physic. It therefore becomes quite redundant in PvE, and Summoners can't even use the spell in PvP. And it's for this reason that the Summoner version of Physic is just another of the spells on this list that was completely useless, as selected by our wonderful commenters. But are there any more spells that you have found to be pretty lackluster over the years? Please share with us in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.